Imagine the most terrifying place on earth. The air is choked with the metallic, suffocating stench of cordite, and the ground beneath your boots trembles under the relentless, deafening rhythm of incoming artillery fire. You are a soldier, standing thousands of miles from a home that no longer exists, fighting a brutal war that has already taken everything from you. And as you struggle to lift a 100-pound crate of high explosives through the wet, sucking mud and the blood, a massive shadow suddenly falls over you. You look up, muscles screaming in agony, expecting to see a screaming officer or the barrel of an enemy rifle. But instead, you are looking directly into the calm, amber eyes of a 500-pound Syrian brown bear. He is standing completely upright on his hind legs. He reaches out his massive, deadly paws, and he gently takes the bomb from your hands to carry it for you. This is not a myth. This is not a desperate hallucination born from the delirium of combat. This is the absolute, astonishingly real story of the only bear in human history to be officially drafted into a modern military, to hold a combat rank, and to walk through the literal fires of hell alongside the men who loved him. The story begins far away from the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe, deep in the desolate, wind-swept Elburz mountains of Iran, in the bitter spring of 1942. A long, battered convoy of Polish soldiers was making its grueling trek across the harsh, rocky terrain. These were not fresh-faced, eager recruits looking for glory. They were the haunted survivors of Anders' army. These were men who had been violently ripped from their homes in Poland, deported to the frozen, brutal depths of Soviet gulags, and starved to the very brink of death. They had been released only because the Soviet Union, now desperately fighting a losing battle against Nazi Germany, needed every single able body it could find. These Polish men were walking skeletons, draped in ragged, ill-fitting uniforms. They were deeply traumatized, entirely stripped of their country, and utterly, profoundly alone in the world. As their transport trucks idled at a dusty mountain pass near the city of Hamadan, breathing in the thin, arid air, they noticed a young Iranian boy sitting in the dirt by the side of the road. Beside him was a squirming, rough burlap sack. When the soldiers cautiously approached, a weak, pathetic whimpering sound drifted from the rough cloth. Inside the sack was a tiny, starving Syrian brown bear cub. His mother had been shot by hunters high in the mountains, and the cub, barely the size of a small dog, was clinging to the last, fading threads of his life. For these hardened, battered soldiers, who had seen the absolute worst of human cruelty, this tiny, helpless creature sparked something profound. He was an orphan of a violent world, just exactly like they were. Without a second of hesitation, they pooled their meagre, precious resources. They traded a handful of Persian coins, a highly valuable tin of corned beef, a chunk of military-issue chocolate, and a Swiss army knife to the boy. They took the sack, and in doing so, they unknowingly changed the course of their own lives forever. They named the little bear Wojtek, a traditional, comforting Polish name that translates to joyful warrior. But what they did not realize was just how difficult keeping this fragile animal alive would be. At first, it was a desperate, hour-by-hour struggle. He was far too young to forage and entirely too weak to eat solid food. The soldiers, displaying a profound, almost maternal tenderness that contrasted sharply with their war-torn, calloused exteriors, had to innovate. They fashioned a makeshift baby bottle out of an empty green glass vodka bottle. They took a piece of heavy uniform fabric, twisted it tightly into a makeshift nipple, and carefully fed the tiny bear warm, sweetened condensed milk. Wojtek would wrap his tiny, sharp, clawed paws around the glass, drinking frantically as the towering soldiers watched over him in breathless silence. Under their fierce, uncompromising protection, the bear did not just survive, he thrived. And he grew. He grew with an astonishing, almost terrifying rapidity. He transformed, week by week, month by month, from a fragile, stumbling ball of fur into a towering, magnificent beast of muscle and bone. Wojtek was officially assigned to the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish 2nd Corps. But you must understand, he was never treated as a mere mascot. He was never treated as a pet or an animal kept in a cage for cheap amusement. To the broken men of the 22nd, Wojtek was a comrade, He was a fellow soldier. He absorbed the culture of the military camp with shocking, near-human intelligence. Because he was raised exclusively by rough, battle-hardened artillerymen, Wojtek began to mimic their exact behaviours, becoming a giant, furry mirror of the men who surrounded him. When the high-ranking officers walked through the dusty camps, the soldiers would instantly snap to rigid attention and bring their hands to their foreheads. Wojtek watched this daily ritual carefully. Soon, the great bear began standing up on his hind legs, raising his massive right paw to his temple and delivering a perfectly crisp military salute. But his integration into human life went much deeper than parlour tricks. Wojtek adopted the actual vices of his fellow soldiers. Water in the desert camps was notoriously unsanitary and scarce, so the men frequently drank light beer to stay hydrated under the blazing sun. Wojtek, never wanting to be left out of the brotherhood, developed a legendary, insatiable fondness for alcohol. The soldiers would hand him a cold glass bottle of beer, and the bear would sit back heavily on his haunches. He would cradle the delicate glass carefully between two massive, lethal claws, tilt his great head toward the sky, and drain the entire bottle in one long, uninterrupted gulp. He would then casually toss the empty bottle into the dirt and look expectantly at his brothers for another. If a soldier was smoking quietly by the fire, Wojtek would lumber over, gently nudging the man with his heavy, wet snout. He had a bizarre, unexplainable obsession with cigarettes. But he did not smoke them. The men would light a cigarette, take a drag, and hand it to the bear. Wojtek would pop the burning tobacco directly into his mouth, chew it up, and swallow it whole, seemingly delighted by the harsh taste of the ash and nicotine. His absolute favourite pastime, however, was wrestling. A full-grown Syrian brown bear is a creature of devastating, lethal power, easily capable of crushing a human skull with a single, effortless swipe. Yet Wojtek possessed an extraordinary, deeply empathetic gentleness. He would seek out the biggest, strongest men in the company, rising up to his full height of over 6 feet, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over the dusty camp. He would lunge forward with astonishing speed, wrapping his heavy arms around a soldier, and the two would tumble violently into the dirt in a chaotic cloud of dust and booming laughter. But Wojtek always knew exactly how much pressure to apply. He would easily overpower the men, playfully pin them to the ground with his sheer weight, and then, instead of baring his razor-sharp teeth, he would drag a gigantic, rough tongue across their sweat-stained faces, licking them affectionately until they surrendered and begged for mercy. For men who had lost their families, who had watched their entire nation be swallowed by empires, this bear was their daily therapy. He was the heavy, warm anchor that kept them tethered to their own humanity when the entire world around them was rapidly descending into madness. When the freezing desert nights dropped below freezing, the soldiers would silently sneak into Wojtek's large canvas tent. They would curl their shivering bodies directly against his massive, 500-pound radiating chest to stave off the biting cold. He was their protector, their living furnace, and without a doubt their closest friend. But this fragile moment of peace was an illusion. The relatively quiet days in the Middle Eastern camps could not last forever. In the early months of 1944, the fires of the European theatre demanded more blood. The Polish Second Corps was mobilised, ordered to pack their gear and sail across the Mediterranean to join the British Eighth Army on the brutal, heavily defended Italian front. The unit packed up their massive artillery cannons and marched to the bustling, chaotic docks of Alexandria, Egypt, preparing to board the massive British transport ship, the MS Batory. But as they approached the towering steel gangway, they slammed into an immovable, invisible wall. The British Transport Command had an incredibly strict, non-negotiable regulation. Absolutely no pets, no mascots, and no wild animals were allowed on military vessels. Only active duty soldiers could board the ships. The British liaison officer stood at the bottom of the ramp, clipboard in hand, shaking his head at the towering brown beast standing amidst the artillery cannons. A wave of absolute cold panic swept through the Polish ranks. Leaving Wojtek behind was unthinkable. It would be exactly like leaving a brother to die in the desert. They were not going to abandon their family. The Polish commanders, desperate to keep their unit's fragile morale from shattering completely, huddled together. And right there on the docks, they orchestrated one of the most brilliant, absurd, and legally flawless loopholes in the entire history of warfare. If the rigid British rules stated that only active duty soldiers could board the ship, then they would simply make the bear a soldier. They rushed through emergency bureaucratic paperwork. They filled out official stamped military enlistment forms. They assigned the bear a rank. They gave him a unique serial number. They even issued him an official military paybook, capturing his massive thumbprint pressed in black ink upon the paper pages. They returned to the docks and proudly presented the bewildered British officer with the documents. The paperwork was immaculate. This was no longer a mascot. This was Private Wojtek of the Polish army. The British officer, entirely stunned and completely outmaneuvered by the sheer brazen audacity of the Polish troops, had absolutely no choice but to step aside. Private Wojtek lumbered up the heavy steel ramp and sailed directly into the heart of the deadliest conflict on Earth. But what happened next would change everything. Private Wojtek's defining moment, the singular event that would cement his legacy into the annals of history forever, occurred in the jagged, towering mountains of Italy. It was May of 1944, during the agonizing, blood-soaked nightmare known as the Battle of Monte Cassino. The Allied forces had been completely stalled for months by the Gustav Line, a heavily fortified, deeply entrenched series of German defences. It was anchored around an ancient, towering Benedictine monastery sitting atop a jagged, unforgiving mountain peak. It was a fortress of rock, wire and concrete, bristling with hidden machine gun nests and heavy, merciless artillery. The terrain was a nightmare of steep, shattered stone, completely inaccessible to heavy supply vehicles. Every single bullet, ration and bomb had to be moved entirely by hand. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was positioned deep in the valley below, tasked with feeding the relentless, insatiable hunger of the heavy artillery cannons that were shelling the German positions day and night. The atmosphere was a terrifying vision of hell. The sky was permanently blackened by thick smoke and pulverized dust. The air pressure constantly, violently changed from the concussive shockwaves of exploding shells. The noise was a physical, crushing weight upon the chest, a ceaseless, deafening roar of German 88mm shells crushing into the earth, throwing jagged shrapnel, boiling mud, and pulverized rock high into the air. The Polish artillerymen were pushed far, far beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. They were deafened, bleeding, and covered in a thick, suffocating paste of sweat, mud, and explosive powder. Their orders were simple, but impossible. They had to haul massive wooden crates, each packed tightly with 4 heavy 25-pound artillery shells, from the supply trucks, across the cratered, muddy terrain, and up the steep hills to the firing line. Each crate weighed well over 100 pounds. Doing this once is exhausting. Doing it continuously, for hours on end, while actively being hunted by precise enemy mortar fire, is agonizing. The men were physically breaking. They were collapsing into the mud from sheer, catastrophic muscle failure. Their hands were completely blistered and raw, their backs tearing under the sheer, brutal weight of the ammunition. The Allied cannons were firing so incredibly fast that the steel barrels were glowing cherry red in the twilight, but the men simply could not carry the heavy shells fast enough to keep them fed. Wojtek was tethered to a post near the supply trucks, visibly agitated by the screaming of the Stuka dive bombers and the endless rolling thunder of the guns. He watched his brothers. He saw them stumbling blindly. He saw them falling to their bleeding knees in the mud, weeping from pure exhaustion, desperately, fruitlessly trying to lift the heavy wooden boxes. He saw his chosen family breaking apart under the strain of war. And then, something unbelievable happened. The bear made a decision. Wojtek snapped his tether. He did not run away from the terrifying noise. He did not seek the safety of a trench to hide from the falling bombs. He calmly, deliberately, walked directly toward the chaotic, terrifying, explosive centre of the supply line. He approached a massive, 3-ton Bedford supply truck, where exhausted, trembling soldiers were frantically trying to unload the ammunition. Wojtek stood up on his hind legs, rising to his full, magnificent height amidst the smoke. He walked upright, step by heavy step, toward an astonished soldier who was holding a crate of live explosives. The bear extended his massive, clawed arms. The soldier, too utterly exhausted, too completely numb to the surrounding nightmare, to even question the absolute absurdity of the moment, simply handed the heavy crate to the bear. Wojtek wrapped his thick, incredibly powerful forearms around the wooden box, containing over 100 pounds of high explosives. He turned his heavy body toward the firing line. And then, the 500-pound bear began to walk. He stepped carefully over the deep, smoking artillery craters. He ignored the deafening, sharp cracks of the sniper rifles. He did not flinch, not even a fraction of an inch, when a German mortar shell slammed into the earth just yards away, showering his thick brown coat in a dangerous spray of deadly dirt and hot shrapnel. He walked directly to the roaring cannons, gently lowered the heavy crate to the muddy ground, without jarring a single volatile shell, and then, without pausing for breath, he turned around to go back for another. For days, amidst the absolute worst horrors of human conflict, this magnificent, silent beast became the unbreakable backbone of the Allied artillery line. Where a human soldier would struggle, slip, and stumble with a single crate, Wojtek carried them effortlessly. He found a strange, beautiful rhythm in the madness. Back and forth, from the rumbling trucks to the screaming cannons. When the rocky terrain became too steep and the wooden crates too unwieldy, Wojtek simply adapted. He would pick up the massive, cylindrical metal artillery shells themselves, cradling the heavy, cold steel directly against his chest like a child, and deliver them directly to the gunner's hands. The sight of this giant, calm animal moving steadily through the thick smoke and the fire had an incalculable, massive psychological impact on the Polish soldiers. Seeing Wojtek, completely fearless, completely dedicated to helping them survive, injected a massive surge of raw, electric adrenaline into the dying men. If the bear was not giving up, they could not give up. They fought with a renewed, ferocious, terrifying intensity. Wojtek never dropped a single shell. He never panicked. He simply worked alongside his brothers, day and night, until the German defences on the mountain finally broke. On May 18, 1944, the smoking ruins of the Monte Cassino monastery finally fell to the Allies, and the red and white flag of Poland was proudly hoisted over the rubble. The victory was secured, but it was paid for in oceans of blood and unimaginable human sacrifice. In the quiet aftermath of the brutal battle, the Polish High Command recognized the absolute truth of what had happened on that mountainside. The actions of the bear were so undeniably heroic, so absolutely vital to the survival and the success of the unit, that the 22nd Artillery Supply Company officially changed their military insignia. From that day forward, every single vehicle, every uniform patch, every pennant in the company bore a new, proud emblem. A stylized brown bear carrying a massive artillery shell in his paws. For his unwavering, incredible bravery under direct enemy fire, Private Wojtek was officially promoted by the High Command to the rank of corporal. Corporal Wojtek survived the war, travelling faithfully with his unit as they pushed further and further into Europe. But when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the story took a slow, heartbreaking turn. The men who had fought so fiercely to liberate Europe, who had sacrificed everything they had to defeat fascism, were coldly betrayed by the geopolitics of the peace. The Yalta Conference handed total control of their beloved Poland to the Soviet Union. The brave men of Anders' army could never go home. If they returned, they would be immediately executed or sent right back to the very Siberian gulags they had so narrowly escaped. They were a victorious army of homeless ghosts, forced into permanent, agonizing exile. The unit was transported to Berwickshire, Scotland, to be slowly, quietly demobilised. Wojtek went with them, becoming a deeply beloved figure in the local Scottish farming villages, attending local dances and swimming happily in the cold rivers. But eventually, the inevitable happened. The unit was formally disbanded. The brothers in arms had to separate to find work, to marry, and to try to build new, quiet lives in a foreign land. They simply could not take a massive, fully grown Syrian brown bear with them into tiny civilian apartments. In November of 1947, with breaking hearts and tear-filled eyes, the veterans brought Corporal Wojtek to his new permanent home, the Edinburgh Zoo. For the men, leaving Wojtek behind thick concrete walls and cold iron bars felt like a profound, sickening betrayal. But the bond they had forged in the blazing fires of Iran, the mud of Italy, and the hell of Monte Cassino could never be severed by mere iron. For the rest of Wojtek's life, the Polish veterans, now scattered across the United Kingdom, would make dedicated, emotional pilgrimages to the zoo. They would stand quietly by the enclosure, looking like an ordinary sight to the passing tourists. But it was a sacred, deeply private reunion for the men. When a veteran would step up to the chain-link fence and softly call out Wojtek's name in the sharp, familiar cadence of the Polish language, the magnificent bear would immediately stop pacing. He would turn, remembering perfectly the voices of the men who had saved him from the burlap sack in the desert. He would sit heavily on his hind legs, raise his massive paw, and deliver a crisp, perfect military salute to his long-lost brothers. Sometimes, completely defying every single safety regulation of the zoo, the older veterans would simply jump over the fences, ignoring the screaming security guards, to sit in the dirt with the giant bear. They would cry, they would playfully wrestle, and they would toss him the cigarettes he still loved to eat. Wojtek passed away quietly in December of 1963, at the age of 21. His death was profound enough to be announced on national television and radio broadcasts across the entire United Kingdom. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to unyielding endurance, and a heartbreaking reminder of the thousands of exiled Polish soldiers who fought so bravely for a freedom they never got to experience themselves. The story of Corporal Wojtek is not just a bizarre, quirky footnote in the vast, terrible history of World War II. It is a profound, beautiful, and lasting truth about the very nature of war and connection. It shows us that even in an era entirely defined by industrial slaughter, genocide, and the absolute darkest depths of human hatred, a profound light can be found in the most unexpected of places. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that loyalty, brotherhood, and true love are not exclusively human traits. Because sometimes, the greatest humanity is found in a massive, 500-pound bear who simply looked at a group of broken, starving men, decided that they were his family, and chose to willingly walk into the fires of hell just to carry their heavy burdens.